Hello, citizens, and welcome to our review video for Unit 5 of AP Government. I know this video has taken a long time to get out there. It's a long overdue, and I'm sorry for that, but life happens. I've even tried to upload this one a couple times, but it's going to work this time. I'm very confident, and I'm ready now to get into it, so let's go ahead and get into it. So Unit 5 of AP Government. This is all about linkage institutions, which are institutions that connect the people to government and allow them to communicate to government what they want government to do. Okay, and there are four main types of linkage institutions that political scientists focus on, and they are political parties, interest groups, the media, and finally elections. So essentially, this video is going to go through all four of those, and we're going to get to them soon. But first, we're going to spend just a little bit of time talking about the most basic form of political participation that Americans participate in, and that is voting. If you're like my students, many of you have either completed U.S. history or are taking U.S. history now, and you'll know that we're far fewer types of people who could participate in American politics at the dawn of the Republic than there are today. And those changes came about through the only means we have of changing the Constitution, and of course we're talking about constitutional amendments. You have the post-Civil War amendments that defined citizenship and granted African Americans the right to vote. And then the Progressive Era amendments that installed direct election of senators and granted women the right to vote. And then finally, the elimination of poll taxes and the lowering of the voting age to 18 here in the second half of the 20th century. All right, let's get to models of voter behavior. Political scientists have identified that voters typically think and make decisions when they are filling out their ballots in a few specific ways. The first of which is rational choice voting. If you're like my students, you're thinking a lot about college at the moment and probably worried about how you're going to pay for your education once you get there. A candidate like Bernie Sanders, who has advocated for years that college should be tuition free, might appeal to a rational voter who is looking to go to college soon. Retrospective voting is when voters look backwards at a candidate's record and decisions, and they have to choose whether that candidate has done a poor job or a good job, like when George W. Bush here ran for re-election in 2004. Prospective voters, on the other hand, they make predictions based on how they believe a candidate will perform in the future. So if someone like Gavin Newsom runs for president in 2028, voters will need to use prospective thinking in order to make a forecast about how he will serve their interests during his administration. And finally, straight ticket voting is when a voter will use a bit of what I like to call a cheat sheet to fill out their ballot. So this is when a voter might say to themselves, I'm a Democrat, or I'm ideologically conservative, and instead of taking time to learn about every candidate on the ballot, they will just vote for all Democrats or all Republicans, kind of like using the answers to the test, so to speak. Okay, let's talk about turnout. Turnout is the amount of people who show up to vote in a given election, and these variables here on the screen are going to impact that. The first are voter registration laws. In my state of California, we have a motor voter program that makes it easy for people who are getting a driver's license to register to vote once they turn 18, removing an obstacle that might otherwise prevent them from registering to vote. Some states might want to ensure that voters are eligible to vote, and they make them obtain voter IDs prior to casting their ballot. Many states have laws allowing them to open polling places before Election Day so voters can turn in their ballots without having to wait for one specific day. Some states have laws allowing for mail-in and absentee voting, which is something I like to use because I'm able to avoid going to a polling place altogether, as my ballot is just delivered to me via the mail, and I fill it out right here at my kitchen table, and then I just walk down the street and put it back in the mailbox, and my vote gets tabulated that way. And finally, a voter's political efficacy, or the belief that their vote will make a difference, will also affect voter turnout. And the way I kind of want you to think about these variables is that they are going to either be obstacles that will get in the way of voting and lower voter turnout, or pathways that make voting easier and will increase turnout. Okay, let's take a look at what affects the choices voters make when they are filling out their ballots. The top thing that voters consider is the characteristics of a candidate. So perhaps voters might be attracted to a guy like Donald Trump because he's wealthy, or because he speaks his mind, or because he wants to put America first, while somebody else might choose someone like Kamala Harris due to her experience in the government at both the federal level and the state level, or maybe they like that she'll be a racial minority or a woman rising to become the most powerful person in the free world, and they kind of like the look of that. It's those individual characteristics that are making the candidate more attractive to the voter. Okay, but you also can't count out that voters are going to consider their own ideology or their party allegiance as well, while other voters may focus on specific issues like the price of eggs or climate change or taxes or gun rights or any other issue that they might care about. All right, now let's get into the first of our linkage institutions, and that is going to be political parties. Parties are organized groups that band together in order to get a wide variety of policies enacted via electing candidates to office. And there's three main roles that parties typically play, and the first of those is recruiting and nominating candidates for office, and then supporting them financially as they run. Parties will also provide labels to voters in that they put out these cheat sheets, so to speak, the ones that we kind of talked about earlier. Okay, sometimes, like especially in presidential election years, there is a lot, and I mean a lot of items on a ballot, and it takes a lot of effort to be knowledgeable about every single one. So parties will want to provide voters with the cheat sheet so a voter can say, you know what, I'm a Democrat in San Diego, who should I vote for? Who did the SD Dems support? Or I'm an Orange County Republican, who does the local political party think I should vote for? Okay, and then finally, parties will want to enact their policies when they are in power, but they will also work to oppose the opposing major party when they are out of power so they can prevent their policies from being enacted. Parties have changed a lot throughout American history, and the big idea I want you to take away from this slide is that parties in the United States are very weak, especially compared to parties in other countries. We are no longer in the era where party bosses dictate actions and from smoke-filled backrooms, and a big reason for that is because American candidates like to run what we call candidate-centered campaigns. When someone like Donald Trump is running for president, he's not saying exactly what the Republican Party is telling him to say. He's speaking off the cuff. He's saying what he thinks. He might be bucking his party a little bit, and some people like that, and he knows that, so that's why he keeps on doing that. Parties have also changed as demographic groups have responded to changing conditions and become either more liberal or conservative over time. And when demographic groups abandon one party for the other, you end up with critical elections and realignment, like when Richard Nixon used the Southern strategy to convince voters in the South to leave behind the Democrats so that they could support states' rights. And finally, parties have used technology to construct sophisticated voter files. They use publicly available data on who is registered to vote, who actually votes, and other demographic data like income, marital status, education levels, and more in order to build a model of what policies a voter is likely to support. And then parties use that data in order to help their candidates get elected. Okay, so if the major parties in the United States are weak, then third parties are completely powerless, and there are a few reasons for that. The first is that some of the good ideas that minor parties come up with are stolen by major parties, like when the Green Party's support of environmental sustainability has been taken up by both Republicans and Democrats in different ways. Another is that even though there's a sizable number of Americans who are not registered with either the Democrats or the Republicans, they have zero power in Congress at the moment. All right, let's take a look at this graph. You can see the data shows that there are close to 45 million Democrats in the United States and another 38 million Republicans, but this yellow line shows that there are nearly 40 million voters that are neither. Yet, as these images show over here on the right, they have zero support in Congress. Everyone is either a blue circle, i.e. a Democrat, or a red circle, a Republican. And so how does this happen? How do these 40 million Americans in the middle who support minor parties, how do they end up with zero support? And that's because in the United States we have winner-take-all elections. So these nearly 40 million minor party supporters are fractured among many smaller parties and have not been able to win the majority support necessary in order to start building a legislating coalition. So even if a place like California has about 4 million Republican voters, there's no difference between that and having zero Republican voters because neither is ever going to eclipse the 8 million Democratic voters. Okay? It does not need to be this way, and in fact, many other countries do not do it this way. Here we see the breakdown for Germany and their Bundestag, and you can see there's a wider diversity of parties present because even if a party only wins 20% of the vote, that 20% is worth something, and it allows minor parties to start making the moves necessary in order to form a legitimate coalition to oppose the other major parties. Millions of Americans recognize the need for minor parties, and they get very frustrated by our winner-take-all system, and it could be different if there was an appetite for it. All right, let's get going with interest groups now. So interest groups take on many roles, and they're a little bit different than political parties in that they have a much narrower focus, right? Whereas political parties are going to want to enact a whole bunch of policies ranging from economic issues to social issues, interest groups often only care about much narrower things, and they only want to focus on those narrow things when they are doing their work in interest groups, okay? And so anyway, they play many roles, and the first of those is educating voters and office holders. I got a stat for you. Did you know this? Did you know that teachers like myself, we only make about 73 cents for every dollar that a comparably educated individual makes. Does that seem fair that somebody who also has a master's degree like I do gets paid $1, whereas I only get 73 cents? That doesn't seem fair to me, so I want to make sure that you know about it, and is exactly what I would be doing if I was acting as a member of an interest group that supports teachers. Okay, why do I do that? Because I want you, as a future voter, to support policies that are going to help teachers make more money, or maybe even you're going to be an office holder one day, and I want you to know that because you might be able to be the person who helps me end up making more money by passing laws that support higher teacher pay. Okay. Interest groups will also have people conducting lobbying. So that's when they go straight to the legislators and try to convince them to support policies that they support. And sometimes they will do that by drafting the legislation, by kind of doing the work of the legislator for them. They'll say, here's the bill. Just go find enough people to pass it, and it can become a law. And then interest groups will also appeal to the other branch, to the judicial branch, by filing amicus curiae briefs. Amicus curiae means friend of the court, and essentially that means they want to provide judges with information so they can make a ruling that the interest group supports. Okay? Now, interest groups are limited by the resources they have access to, namely in the form of members and the money those interest groups can provide. So an interest group like the American Petroleum Institute over here on the left, they have revenue exceeding $267 million, so they can do a lot more than a group like the Sierra Club, which has only got $173 million in that same year. All right, we're going to do campaigns next in just a moment, but I want to spend a minute first going over differing terms and election cycles for the executive and legislative branch. Okay, I think most people know that the President of the United States, signified by this symbol right here, they serve a 4-year term, and they are elected during a presidential election year, which of course is a year that is divisible by 4. Okay, so the new president, Donald Trump, he started his term here in January 2025, and he will continue to serve until 2028, when there will be a new presidential election, and then the next president will begin their term in 2029. Okay, now the Senate is one body with 100 members, but unlike the House, the entire Senate is never up for re-election all at once, and that's because they have divided out the Senate into 3 different groups, which we call classes. So Class 1, they just had their most recent election in 2024. So they started their new term in January of this year, and they will continue to serve until the very beginning of 2031, and they'll be up for re-election in 2030. Class 2 will get their next shot in 2026, Class 3 in 2028. So you only get a third of the Senate that's up for election in any given year. The House of Representatives, on the other hand, that body does, or at least can, turn over in theory every single election cycle. Okay, so they serve very short 2-year terms, and essentially they are always having to think about running for re-election because they are going to be up for re-election every other year. All right, let's go ahead and focus next on presidential elections and the Electoral College. All right, there's a lot on this topic out there already, so I'm not going to get into too much detail here, but I do want to focus for a minute on the 2000 election that pitted Vice President Al Gore against the governor of Texas, George W. Bush. What you should know is that when normal voters like you and I, when we vote for President of the United States, we are not actually technically voting for the specific candidate. We are instead voting for a slate of electors, and those electors are real people who are going to submit their own vote in the Electoral College for the person who becomes the President of the United States. Okay, so essentially we are voting for voters. Okay, and how many electors your state has is dependent on how many members of Congress it has. So back in 2000, my state, California, we had 52 members of the House of Representatives, plus, of course, 2 members of the Senate. So that adds up to 54. So we had 54 electoral votes in 2000. Now, that sounds like a lot, and indeed it is more than any other state in the union, but because we have so many people in California, if you were to divide all those people into 54 electoral votes, we are actually underrepresented at a national scale, especially compared to a state like Wyoming, which has well under 1 million people, but they still have 3 electoral votes. It creates like a little bit of a mathematical imbalance there, where an electoral vote in Wyoming is worth more people than it is here in California. Okay, and that mathematical imbalance makes it possible for the candidate who receives the most popular votes, which you can see right over here. Al Gore had nearly 51 million popular votes. He had more popular votes than George W. Bush, but he lost the election, okay? This is like the worst game ever where the team that scores the most runs can lose. And this is another aspect of the American political system that millions of Americans dislike very much. And it could be changed if there was a critical mass of Americans who wanted it to change. All right, now let's run through the process candidates will go through during the election process. First, you should know that candidates who are incumbents, meaning they are holding the office currently, they typically have a big advantage. Okay, what do Bill Clinton, George W. Bush, Barack Obama, and Donald Trump all have in common? It's nothing to do with their policy. It's the fact that they all were reelected. And in Donald Trump's case, they were eventually reelected, not on the first try for him. But that's because those candidates, they're a known quantity to voters, okay? People know their policies, people know their names, people know their faces, they know what they're about, and they've won before. This is the United States of America. We love to back a winner here. So candidates who are incumbents typically have a large advantage compared to challengers, okay? Once somebody decides they want to start running for office, there's typically going to be at least one other person that's from their own party that's opposing them. So they need to seek the nomination of their party, and most states will do that via primary elections. Okay? Now, some states will run what's called an open primary, meaning you can just show up to the polling place and say, I want a ballot for the Republican Party or I want a ballot for the Democratic Party, and they will then give you that ballot, and then you can go ahead and fill it out. And whoever gets the most votes in that state, those delegates will be pledged to that candidate. Okay, some states run closed primaries, in which case you need to be registered with that party in order to receive that party's ballot. Okay, some other states like Iowa, they also do their caucuses, which is kind of like a primary in that the goal is to narrow the field down to one candidate, but it's a little bit different in that it involves kind of like going from corner to corner in a gym and convincing people that your candidate's the best. And honestly, kind of sounds kind of interesting to me. It kind of sounds like something I would have some fun at. And then finally, once the parties have decided on who their candidates are going to be, they show up to the party convention where they accept the nomination and they take the stage in the football stadium. They try to make the case to the American public why they are the best candidate for the job. All right, let's get into campaigns. And the most important thing you need to know about campaigns is that they have gotten much more expensive over the years. Candidates need to spend a lot of money on ads on both social media and more traditional media in order to get their message out and convince voters to support them. Campaigns are also more expensive because they rely on large teams of experienced political consultants to guide their campaigns, and also because in the United States, we have extremely long election cycles. Other countries have laws limiting how long an election can take place, like maybe 10 weeks, 8 weeks, something like that. And there's no such law here in the United States of America. So even today, as I'm shooting this in 2025, even though the next presidential election is close to 3 years away, you still have candidates today who are jockeying for position in that race, and there's already polling here showing us who's ahead or who's behind. All right, next let's talk about campaign finance. This story starts in the 1970s with the creation of the Federal Election Commission, and in 1976, the Supreme Court decided in Buckley v. Vallejo that limits on financial contributions to campaigns are legal unless a candidate wants to spend their own money on their own campaign, right? So I could spend every last cent I have on my own campaign, but I would be limited to donating money to other people's campaigns, to whatever the cap would be. This limitation was strengthened in 2002 with the Bipartisan Campaign Reform Act, and this bans the soft money that had to take a more circuitous route to the candidates, and it really made them rely on hard money, or money that is given directly to the candidates, and again is subject to that cap. This limitation existed until 2010 when the Supreme Court overturned Buckley v. Vallejo and BICRA with their decision in Citizens United v. the FEC. The Citizens United decision held that caps on campaign contributions are unconstitutional infringements on your First Amendment right to free speech. The First Amendment says you can essentially use your speech to do whatever you want. So if you want to give every last cent that you have to whatever candidate, the First Amendment protects your right to do that. Now, you might see the obvious problem that this creates in that regular voters like you and me who have financial limitations, we have no hope of keeping up with wealthier people, right? This opens the door for the most wealthy among us to be able to use their extreme wealth in order to influence political candidates and essentially get the policies that they support passed. All right. Now, much of the money that ends up with campaigns gets funneled through PACs and super PACs. PAC stands for Political Action Committee, and those groups are often directly tied to candidates, while super PACs are more independent of candidates and can receive unlimited amounts of money that can be directed to campaigns, as long as there is no coordination between them and the candidate. All right, finally, let's move on to our last linkage institution, which is the media. The media covers politics in four distinct ways, and the first is going to be event coverage. So this is when networks like CNN might send a reporter out like Caitlin Collins to the White House so she can report on what's happening with the president that day. Investigative journalism, on the other hand, is when reporters will come through data or talk to sources, and their goal is to try to find a story they believe will benefit the public in some way. And oftentimes these are stories that some politician will not want the public to find out about. And then the two types of coverage that the networks love because it gets them a lot of money are election coverage and political commentary, where they will have journalists in front of maps or analyzing data and offering opinions on how the races are going. Now, this unfortunately often leads to horse race journalism, in which journalists will cover elections a lot like sports, kind of pointing out who's ahead, what moves that got them to be ahead, what moves are putting them behind, and how these different moves are resulting in fluctuations in the polling data. And this is often at the expense of talking about the issues and how different policies will affect voters. And unfortunately, this results in a reduction in the quality of information that voters receive. All right, now media has changed a lot over the last 100 years or so as Americans have transitioned from getting their news from the newspaper to the radio to TV to the internet and personal computers to cell phones and social media. Okay, Americans still get their news in varying extents from all of those different sources, but primarily who relies on each one differs with how old Americans are. Right? The older you are, the more likely you are to be getting your news from the newspaper or from radio or from TV. The younger you are, the much more likely you are to be getting your news from social media and from internet and from your cell phone. Now, information can obviously be delivered much more easily via social media, but there's also the risk that this coverage can be biased, slanted, misleading, or sometimes just not true. It can be fake. So what I usually do is I like to recommend to my students that they become critical consumers of the information that they are consuming. And they use charts like this media bias chart from this group called Ad Fontes Media, so they can be aware of their biases that exist and try to. And I also think they should try to mix up their news sources from time to time, so they avoid getting stuck in an information silo, which would prevent them from seeing issues in many different ways. All right, that's it. That is it for AP Government. That is it for Unit 5. I'm sorry it took me as long as it did, but hey, better late than never is going to be my attitude for this one. Thank you so much for all the support for over the years. Thank you so much for sticking with me. I know you're going to do great on your AP exam. I know you're going to do great next year in college or whatever is in your future. Thank you so much for the support. Feel free to follow on Instagram and Twitter, and we'll see you guys in the next one. Have a good one. See you later.